In a town built on secrets, one woman's silence was about to be broken by a man who wasn't supposed to be there. And the truth they were about to uncover wouldn't just set them free, it would burn the whole town to the ground. The wind in Dry Creek didn't just blow, it scoured. It scraped the paint from the buildings and the hope from people's eyes, leaving behind nothing but dust and judgment. And in the center of that dust bowl stood Clara Thorne, a woman made of porcelain and steel. She was the school teacher, a widow who had buried a husband and then a child so small the coffin was hardly bigger than a shoebox. The town watched her, waiting for her to break. But Clara didn't break. She just got quiet. So quiet you could almost forget she was there. She ran the schoolhouse with a gentle hand, teaching psalms to children who were more wild than pious. When the bell rang, they'd explode out into the dirt yard, a storm of bare feet and shouting, all except one. Zeke Rowan, a 10-year-old boy with eyes that had seen too much and a mouth that had forgotten how to speak. His family had been taken by the winter 2 years back. The cold stole their breath, and it stole Zeke's voice right along with it. He just stopped talking. Now he clung to his slate, and his silence like a shield. Clara understood. She had her own shield. Hers was made of polite smiles and looking away. Dry Creek didn't like things it couldn't understand. A woman alone. A boy who wouldn't speak. They were thorns in the town's side. The old hens at the boarding house, led by the sharp-tongued widow Langery, clucked their disapproval behind cupped hands. She didn't even cry right at the funeral, they'd whisper. And now she keeps that strange boy close. It ain't natural. Clara heard them. She always heard them. But she let the words wash over her. They were just noise. The real monster was the quiet in her own little house. The silence where a child's laugh should have been. But that evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, a new silence fell over Dry Creek. A different kind of silence. A heavy, watchful one. Because something had arrived. He sat on a lean Mustang at the edge of town, a silhouette against the dying light. A man who was bigger than the sky, with skin the color of rich earth and 2 long, black braids tied with strips of red cloth. Scars ran down his arms like rivers, each one telling a story the town didn't want to hear. He didn't move. He just watched. Windows were cracked. Curtains were parted. The whole town was holding its breath. Finally, Sheriff Boaz Miller stepped out onto the boardwalk. He was a decent man, but a man who valued peace above all else, even if it was a rotten, unjust peace. He put one hand on his pistol, a gesture that was half threat, half habit. "Can I help you?" Boaz asked, his voice tight. The stranger's voice was like rocks grinding together, low and ancient. "I need a place to stay," he said. "I bring meat. I fix things. I ask for no trouble." "And who might you be?" Boaz pressed. The man's eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked toward the hills. "Red Elk." Boaz shifted his weight. "That's a Comanche name." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Red Elk just nodded, a single slow nod. "That could be a problem," the sheriff said, and the whole town exhaled in agreement. Across the street, Clara was walking home. She paused, her satchel clutched to her chest. Her eyes met the stranger's. It was just for a second. There was no pity in his gaze, no hunger, no judgment. He just saw her. For the first time in years, Clara felt like someone was actually seeing her. The steel beneath the porcelain. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. And in that moment, a single invisible thread was strung between the silent woman and the outcast stranger. A thread that was about to pull the whole rotten fabric of Dry Creek apart. That night, the boarding house was buzzing. Widow Langery, the town's self-appointed moral compass, was holding court. "Mark my word," she declared, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Nothing good ever came riding in at dusk wearing the devil's own braids." Her eyes landed on Clara, who was sitting by the hearth, trying to disappear into her teacup. "You best keep your distance from him, Clara. You've had enough scandal for 2 lifetimes." Clara just nodded. Arguing was pointless. But as she walked home, the stranger's eyes were burned into her mind. She'd seen drifters and deserters, men with hollow eyes and broken spirits. But she'd never seen a man who looked so solid, so rooted to the earth. even as he sat on the edge of a town that wanted to spit him out. Her hands trembled as she lit her lamp, and for the first time, the silence in her house felt different. It wasn't just empty anymore. It was waiting. Red Elk didn't push. He made a small, rough camp out by the broken-down windmill on the edge of town. He hunted, and the meat he brought to the general store was always a clean kill. He bartered for what he needed, his words few and his voice low. He never stayed long. When he entered the blacksmith's, the other men would fall silent and shuffle out. When he walked past the church, the preacher would pointedly turn his head. Red Elk acted as if he didn't notice, but Clara saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself perfectly still, like a man waiting for a blow to land. He was a stone in the river, and the current of the town's hatred was wearing itself out trying to move him. A few days later, a small drama unfolded at the schoolhouse. Zeke, the silent boy, brought a knife to class. It wasn't a threat, it was a treasure. A beautifully carved blade with a handle of polished bone. Clara took it from him gently, her heart pounding. She knew where it came from. She didn't need to ask. On his slate, Zeke drew a horse, then a single feather. He pointed toward the hills. He was spending time with Red Elk. The town would have a fit if they knew. She had to give it back. That evening, she found Red Elk by the schoolhouse well, sharpening another knife on a whetstone. The sound was rhythmic, patient. Zeke stood a few feet away, watching with an intensity that was startling in a child. He was mesmerized. Clara walked up, her boots crunching in the dirt. Red Elk looked up, his hands never ceasing their motion. He wasn't surprised to see her. "This is Zeke's," she said, holding out the knife. Red Elk didn't take it. He just looked at the boy. "He watches like a hawk," he said, his voice softer than she'd heard it before. "Quiet eyes see more." "He lost his voice," Clara explained, the words feeling thin and useless. "The winter his family passed." Red Elk didn't offer pity. He simply reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled something out. It was a small horse, carved from a piece of pale wood, so smooth it looked like polished stone. It was simple, but it was perfect. The lines were clean, the spirit of the animal captured in the arch of its neck. He held it out to her. "For him," he said. Clara took it. Their fingers didn't touch, but a jolt went through her all the same. It felt like warmth, like life. She gave the horse to Zeke, and the boy's face, usually a stoic mask, broke into a small, hesitant smile. It was the first time she'd seen him smile in 2 years. It was like watching a frozen river begin to thaw. That night, Clara sat by her window, the wooden horse on the table beside her, and she wondered about the man who could carve such a gentle thing with the same hands that bore such fearsome scars. She thought he was just a wanderer, a man looking for a place to rest. She was wrong. He wasn't looking for a place to rest. He was looking for something he had lost, something that had been stolen, something that was buried right here, in the rotten heart of Dry Creek. A strange, unspoken rhythm began. Red Elk would leave a dressed rabbit or a brace of quail on Clara's back porch before dawn. In return, she'd leave a loaf of fresh cornbread on the stump near his camp. No words were exchanged, no thanks were given. It was a language of survival, a quiet alliance between the town's two outcasts. He started fixing things. He rethatched a section of the church roof that had been damaged in a summer storm. He mended Widow Langley's collapsed chicken coop, even though she peered at him through her curtains the whole time, her face a mask of suspicion. He never asked for payment. Fixing things, it seemed, was his way of speaking. But Dry Creek didn't trade in kindness. It traded in fear. The whispers grew louder, turning from gossip into warnings. The preacher started delivering sermons about heathen influences and snakes in our garden, his eyes always seeming to find Clara in her pew. The breaking point came at Sunday supper at the boarding house. Widow Langley slammed her fork down. "They'll say you're not fit to teach our children, Clara Thorne," she hissed, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Trading food with that savage." For the first time, Clara didn't just absorb the blow. She looked up, her teacup rattling in its saucer. "And who decides what makes someone unfit?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. The widow scoffed. "We do. The ones who stayed. The ones who bury our dead proper." Her eyes narrowed into cruel slits. "Don't you forget, you're not one of us either. Your husband dragged you to this dust heap and then had the decency to die and leave you to it. You should be grateful we let you stay at all." The words were meant to sting, and they did. But something had changed in Clara. She had survived the silence of her own grief. The noise of their hatred seemed smaller now. The next day, she found Red Elk repairing the rickety fence around the schoolyard. The children were inside, but they kept sneaking glances out the window, their fear slowly being replaced by a hesitant curiosity. Clara brought him a dipper of water. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. He took a long drink before answering. "Fixing what's broken is easier than leaving it to rot." His eyes met hers, and there was a question in them. "This town," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "they won't make it easy for you to stay." "I don't ask for easy," he replied, his gaze sweeping over the dusty town. "Just space." Suddenly, Clara noticed something half buried in the dirt near the fence post he was digging. It was a glint of metal. Curious, she knelt down and worked it free from the hard, packed earth. It was a locket, small, silver, and tarnished with age. It was heart-shaped. She pried it open with her thumbnail. Inside, on one side, was a faded miniature portrait of a young woman with dark, laughing eyes. On the other side was a tiny, folded piece of paper. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a map. A crude drawing of Dry Creek, but with landmarks that were wrong. The church was in a different place. The creek bed was wider, and there was a symbol, a small star, drawn over the exact spot where the schoolhouse now stood. Red Elk had gone still beside her. He was staring at the locket, his face unreadable, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his hammer. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice a low growl. I, I just found it," she stammered. "Right here." He reached out, not to take the locket, but to trace the star on the map with his finger. "This star," he said, his voice heavy with a meaning she couldn't grasp. "It marks the place where my mother was buried." Clara's blood ran cold. The schoolhouse. Her schoolhouse was built on a grave. And that wasn't the worst of it. The woman in the portrait, Clara had seen her before, not in person, but in a faded photograph on her late husband's desk. It was his mother. Red Elk was staring at the portrait of the woman who was, impossibly, also his mother, which meant the man she had buried, the man she had loved, was this stranger's brother. The world tilted. Clara stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. A brother? Her quiet, gentle husband, a man who loved books and hated confrontation, had a brother he never once mentioned? A brother who was now standing in front of her, a living ghost forged in a world of hardship she couldn't imagine? It didn't make sense. None of it. Red Elk seemed to understand her shock. His face softened, just a fraction, the hard lines around his eyes easing. "His name was Thomas," Red Elk said, his voice quiet. "Thomas Thorne. Our mother was Comanche. Our father was a white trader. When he died, she brought us here, to her people's land. This wasn't Dry Creek then. It was just home." He pointed to the locket. "He always carried that. Our mother gave it to him. She was taken by the sickness. We buried her under the great oak that stood right here." He looked at the schoolhouse, his eyes filled with a grief so old it was like a part of the landscape. Then the others came. They had papers, deeds. They said the land was theirs. We were children. They separated us, sent Thomas to a church school in the East to be civilized. I ran, I escaped. I spent my whole life trying to get back. Clara's mind was reeling. The town of Dry Creek was built on a lie, on stolen land. Her husband, Thomas, had been brought here, to this very town. Had he known? Had he been trying to tell her something? She remembered his last few months, how he'd become withdrawn, obsessed with old town records, spending late nights poring over maps that made no sense to her at the time. He'd told her he was just interested in local history, but maybe it was something more. Maybe he had discovered the truth, and it had gotten him killed. The town doctor had called it a sudden fever, quick and vicious. But what if it wasn't a fever at all? "I've been searching for him for years," Red Elk continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I heard rumors of a man named Thorne living out here. I came to find my brother." He looked at her, and now she understood the look he'd given her that first day. It wasn't just seeing her. It was recognition. I saw you. I saw the way you carry your grief. The same way he did. I knew. I just didn't know he was gone. A new, terrible thought began to form in Clara's mind. She ran back into the empty schoolhouse. Red Elk right behind her. She went to her desk and pulled out the old worn Bible her husband had kept there. It was the only thing of his she'd brought with her. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers clumsy. She flipped past the Psalms, past the Gospels, to a small, hidden pocket sewn into the inside of the back cover. Thomas had shown it to her once, calling it his secret place for keeping thoughts. Inside was a single folded piece of yellowed paper. It was a letter, written in her husband's familiar, neat script. But it wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to the territorial marshal. My name is Thomas Thorne, it began. I have come to Dry Creek to claim the land of my mother, a member of the Numunu people. The deed held by the town's founding father, Jedediah Langley, is a forgery. I have obtained the original treaty documents that prove my claim. I believe Mr. Langley and the other town elders know this, and I fear for my life. Jedediah Langley, Widow Langley's late husband, the man praised as a town hero, a pioneer. He was a thief and likely a murderer. Thomas hadn't died of a fever. He'd been silenced, and he'd hidden the proof right here in this Bible, knowing Clara would keep it safe. Red Elk read the letter over her shoulder, his breath catching in his throat. The silence that filled the small schoolhouse was no longer one of grief. It was the heavy, charged silence that comes before a storm breaks. They weren't just two outcasts anymore. They were the keepers of a truth that could tear Dry Creek down to its foundations. And the people who had killed her husband were still here. They were watching, and they would do anything to keep their secret buried. Clara looked at Red Elk, her fear slowly being replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They lied, she whispered. They lied about everything. He nodded, his jaw set like stone. Yes, he said. And now we make them tell the truth. The alliance was sealed, not with a handshake, but with a shared secret that was as dangerous as a lit fuse. They were no longer just a widow and a wanderer. They were a reckoning. They had to move carefully. The original treaty documents Thomas mentioned in his letter were their only real weapon, and they had no idea where he had hidden them. The town elders, the preacher, the blacksmith, and Sheriff Boaz, whose father had been the previous sheriff, were all sons of the town's founders. They had everything to lose. Clara started searching. She scoured Thomas's few belongings, the books he'd loved, the small writing desk where he'd penned his last desperate letter. Nothing. It was like he had vanished, taking his secrets with him. Meanwhile, Red Elk changed his tactics. He no longer stayed on the outskirts. He started looking for work in the heart of the town, his eyes and ears open. He was mapping the town's relationships, listening to the whispers, trying to find the cracks in their wall of lies. His presence was a constant, unnerving reminder. He was a ghost they couldn't get rid of. Zeke, the silent boy, became their shadow. He seemed to understand, in that way children do, that the world had shifted. He watched them, his dark eyes missing nothing. He started bringing Clara drawings that were more than just childish scribbles. One was of the church, but with a detailed drawing of a loose floorboard under the pulpit. Another was of the blacksmith shop with an X marked on a section of the stone wall behind the forge. He was showing them hiding places, places a boy, small and unnoticed, could discover. He was their spy. One evening, Clara decided to act on one of Zeke's clues. She told the boarding house she was feeling unwell and retired early. But instead of going to bed, she slipped out into the darkness and made her way to the church. The door was unlocked. The air inside was cold and smelled of old wood and hypocrisy. With her heart pounding, she crept to the pulpit. She found the loose floorboard exactly where Zeke had drawn it. She pried it up with her fingers. Underneath was a small, dust-covered wooden box. It wasn't the treaty. It was a collection of old daguerreotypes. Pictures of the founding families, smiling and proud. And in the back, one picture that was different. It was of Jedediah Langley shaking hands with a man in a military uniform. But behind them, half hidden in the shadows, was another man. A man with a familiar, cruel face. It was Josiah Crane's father. Crane was the town drunk and bully, a man everyone dismissed. But his family had been here from the beginning. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind her. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. She wasn't alone. "Looking for something, school teacher?" A voice slurred from the darkness. Josiah Crane stepped out from behind a pew, a bottle dangling from one hand, and his eyes gleaming with a greasy, malevolent light. "My father used to say this church was built on secrets. Always wondered what he meant." He took a step closer, his shadow swallowing her. "You've been mighty friendly with that savage. People are talking, saying you've forgotten your place." Clara stood up slowly, her mind racing. "I was just praying," she said, her voice trembling. "Praying?" he sneered, taking another step. "You look like you're digging for treasure." He lunged, grabbing the box from her hands. He looked at the picture of his father. A strange, bitter smile twisted his lips. "Always trying to get in with the big men, my old man was. Langley and the others. They promised him a piece of the pie. But they gave him scraps. Just scraps." His eyes focused on Clara again, and the bitterness curdled into something uglier. "They got their land. They got rich. You got your respectable dead husband. What did I get? Nothing." He shoved the pictures back in the box and threw it to the floor. "Maybe I'll take something for myself. Something they all want to protect." He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "A pretty little widow like you. You need a real man to look after you." Clara screamed. Just as Crane backhanded her across the face, the church doors burst open. Red Elk stood there, framed against the moonlight, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't shout. He didn't make a sound. He just moved. He crossed the church in 3 long strides and pulled Crane off of Clara as if he were a child. He held the sputtering, terrified man up by the collar, his knuckles white. "Touch her again," Red Elk said, his voice a deadly whisper, "and they will find your bones scattered in the hills come spring." He threw Crane out of the church, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Crane scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the night like the coward he was. Red Elk turned back to Clara, his eyes searching her face. He gently touched the red mark on her cheek. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered, though she was shaking uncontrollably. "I'm fine." She looked down at the spilled pictures, at the face of Josiah Crane's father, a man on the fringes of the conspiracy. The town's secret wasn't held by just a few powerful men. It was a web, and they had just pulled on one of its threads. Now the spider was going to come looking for them. The attack in the church changed everything. The secret was no longer a silent, buried thing. It was alive, and it had teeth. Clara knew they couldn't wait any longer. Crane was a drunk and a fool, but he was a scared fool, and he would talk. He would go to the town elders and tell them what he saw, and they would know that Clara was digging into the past. Her husband's fever was a chilling reminder of what they were capable of. Time was running out. They needed a sanctuary, a place to think. Red Elk's open camp was too exposed. That night, under the cover of darkness, he moved his few belongings to the small, abandoned root cellar behind Clara's little house. It was cramped and damp, but it was hidden. In the flickering lantern light, surrounded by the smell of earth and potatoes, they laid out what they knew. The forged deed, the stolen land, the murder of her husband. The letter in the Bible was their proof of Thomas's suspicions, but without the original treaty he mentioned, it was just one dead man's word against a whole town. "The blacksmith shop," Clara said, remembering Zeke's other drawing. "The X on the wall. Thomas spent a lot of time there. He said he was helping with the forge, but maybe he hid it there," Red Elk finished. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. The blacksmith, a man named Peters, was the son of one of the original founders. His forge was the heart of the town, always busy, always watched. Getting inside would be nearly impossible. But they had an advantage. They had Zeke. The next morning, Zeke accidentally let one of the schoolhouse's heavy window shutters break. As expected, Mr. Peters was called to repair it. While the large, gruff man worked, grumbling about shoddy craftsmanship, Zeke was underfoot, watching with wide, innocent eyes. No one paid any attention to the mute boy. And as Peters worked, Zeke did exactly what Clara had asked him to do. He took a small piece of charcoal from his pocket, and when no one was looking, He drew a single perfect star on the heel of Peter's left boot, the symbol from the map. Later that day, Red Elk went to the blacksmith's shop. He needed a new axe head, he said. As Peters heated the iron his back to the door, Red Elk saw it, the charcoal star on his boot. It was a faint mark, but in the firelight, it was unmistakable. Their hunch had been right. Peters was involved, but he was also their way in. That night, a storm rolled in, one of those violent prairie squalls that seemed to tear the sky in half. Thunder rattled the windows and rain came down in blinding sheets. It was the perfect cover. Dressed in dark clothes, Clara and Red Elk slipped through the muddy streets to the blacksmith's shop. The lock was heavy, but Red Elk worked a thin piece of metal into it, his hands steady despite the raging storm. With a soft click, the lock gave way. Inside, the forge was still warm, the air thick with the smell of coal and hot iron. They lit a small shielded lantern. Following the memory of Zeke's drawing, they went to the stone wall at the back. There it was, a single stone, slightly looser than the others. Red Elk used his knife to pry it free. Behind it was a dark, hollow space. Clara reached inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her fingers brushed against oilcloth. She pulled it out. It was a bundle wrapped tight and tied with twine. With trembling hands, she unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, and tucked inside the ledger was a thick, folded document sealed with wax. The paper was old, the ink faded, but the words were clear. It was the original treaty signed by a U.S. Army captain and a Comanche chief. It granted this entire valley, from the Weeping Willow to the Sunstone on the ridge, to the people of the Starwater clan, signed, sealed, and official. The land belonged to Red Elk's people, but there was something else in the bundle. The ledger. Clara opened it. It was a record book, kept by the original blacksmith, Peter's father, and it detailed payments. Payments to the town doctor for services rendered on the night Thomas Thorne died. Payments to Josiah Crane's father for keeping quiet. And a final chilling entry, dated the week after Thomas's death. J.L. paid in full. The Thorne problem is solved. The land is ours. God forgive us. J.L. Jedediah Langley. It was all there. A confession, written in the blacksmith's own hand. They had it. They had the proof that could burn them all. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the front of the shop. The bar they'd placed across the door had been thrown aside. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by a flash of lightning. It was Sheriff Boaz Miller, his face grim, his gun drawn and steady. "Drop it, Red Elk," the sheriff said, his voice flat and cold. "I was wondering when you'd make your move. Peters was getting nervous. Said you were asking too many questions." He took a step inside, rain dripping from his hat. "I'm sorry, Clara. I truly am. But this town has a way of bearing its mistakes. I'm afraid you and him are a mistake we can't afford." They were trapped. The proof was in their hands, but they were standing in a locked room with a man who had just admitted to being part of the cover-up. The law in Dry Creek wasn't there to protect them. It was there to bury them. The air in the blacksmith shop crackled, thick with the smell of rain and ozone and the metallic tang of fear. Sheriff Boaz stood his ground, gun leveled. He wasn't a monster. Clara could see that. He was just a weak man, trapped in a legacy of crime he'd inherited. His father had been the lawman who looked the other way, and now Boaz was doing the same. It was easier than facing the truth. "Don't do this, Boaz," Clara pleaded, her voice steady despite the terror coiling in her stomach. She held up the ledger. "It's all in here. The payments, the cover-up, my husband's murder. You can make this right." "Right!" Boaz let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "There is no right in this town, Clara. There's only survival. My father, Peters's father, Langley. They did what they had to do to build this place. Maybe it wasn't clean, but it's our home now." His eyes hardened. "And I'll be damned if I let a ghost and an outsider tear it all down." Red Elk hadn't moved. He stood like a statue carved from granite, his eyes locked on the sheriff. He slowly placed the treaty on the anvil between them. "This isn't about tearing anything down," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is about honoring what was. My mother is buried here. My brother is buried here. Their blood is in the soil. That gives me more right to it than any forged piece of paper." A flicker of doubt crossed the sheriff's face, but before he could respond, another sound cut through the storm. A high, piercing whistle. Red Elk's Mustang, which had been tethered in the alley, suddenly reared and kicked violently against the back wall of the shop. The wall, old and poorly mortared, shuddered. Another kick and another. The horse was in a frenzy. It wasn't a frenzy, it was a signal. Zeke. The boy must have followed them, must have seen the sheriff arrive. He was creating a diversion. It was the chance they needed. As Boaz glanced toward the noise, his attention diverted for a single second. Red Elk moved. He didn't go for the gun. He kicked the base of the heavy anvil. The massive block of iron, weighing hundreds of pounds, tipped. It crashed to the floor with a deafening boom, sending a shower of sparks up from the hot coals in the forge. The sparks landed on a pile of oil-soaked rags in the corner. In an instant, the rags ignited. Flames shot up the wooden wall, licking at the dry timber of the ceiling. The shop was turning into an inferno. "The proof!" Clara screamed, grabbing the ledger and the treaty from the anvil just as the flames reached it. Boaz was stunned, caught between the fire and them. "What have you done?" he yelled, his face pale in the flickering orange light. "We didn't do this," Red Elk said, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her toward the back window. "You did. You and your whole town, when you chose a lie over the truth." He smashed the window with a hammer and pulled Clara through the opening, out into the raging storm. They scrambled into the muddy alley, the heat of the fire on their backs. Behind them, they could hear Sheriff Boaz shouting, his voice lost in the roar of the thunder and the crackle of the flames. The fire spread with terrifying speed. The blacksmith shop became a beacon, a funeral pyre for all of Dry Creek's secrets. Doors flew open. People poured into the street, their faces ghostly in the firelight. They saw the flames, and then they saw Clara and Red Elk emerging from the alley, smoke-stained and desperate. Widow Langley was the first to point a trembling finger. "It was them!" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The savage and the harlot! They've burned it down! They're trying to destroy us!" Josiah Crane, drawn by the commotion, saw his chance for revenge. "She's a witch!" he screamed, his voice thick with liquor and malice. "And he's her demon. They set the fire. I saw them." The town, already primed with suspicion and fear, turned into a mob. Their fear of the fire, of the outsiders, of the secrets they all subconsciously knew were buried beneath their feet, boiled over into a singular, mindless rage. They started to advance on them, their faces twisted into masks of hatred. There was no law here now, no reason, just the mob. Clara and Red Elk were back to back, the precious proof clutched in Clara's hands. They were surrounded. The whole world had become a vortex of fire and rain and screaming. There was nowhere to run. Just as the first man lunged, a new sound cut through the din. It was a small sound, but it was so unexpected, so impossible, that it stopped everyone in their tracks. It was a voice, a child's voice, clear and strong, shouting a single word. "No!" Everyone turned. Standing on the steps of the chapel, his small body drenched with rain, was Zeke. His mouth was open, his face was alive with a fierce, protective light. He wasn't silent anymore. And he was pointing, not at Clara or Red Elk, but at Josiah Crane. "He lies," Zeke said, his voice cracking with disuse but ringing with undeniable truth. "I saw him. He followed them. He had a torch." The mob faltered. They had all known Zeke as the mute boy, the silent ghost. To hear him speak now, in this moment, was like hearing a message from God. The boy who had been silenced by trauma had found his voice to speak the truth. Josiah Crane's face went white with terror. "He's lying. The boy is bewitched," he stammered. But it was too late. Sheriff Boaz, who had escaped the burning building, pushed his way through the crowd. He'd heard Zeke. He'd seen the look on Crane's face. The lie was broken. He walked past Clara and Red Elk and grabbed Crane by the collar. "Is that right, Josiah? Did you set this fire to cover your tracks?" Crane crumbled. All the fight went out of him, replaced by pathetic sobs. "She wouldn't have me," he wept. "She looked at me like I was dirt." I just wanted to scare her, to scare them both. A collective gasp went through the crowd. They had been ready to tear two innocent people apart, fueled by the lies of a bitter, pathetic man. The fire still raged, but the heat of their mob fury had cooled, replaced by a cold, creeping shame. Clara stepped forward, her clothes torn, her face smudged with soot, but her voice did not tremble. She held up the ledger and the treaty. "This is the real reason for the fire," she said, her voice carrying over the crackling flames. "This is the truth of Dry Creek." She looked at Widow Langley, whose face had gone ashen. "Your husband, madam, was a thief and a murderer. He stole this land from Red Elk's people. And when my husband, Red Elk's brother, discovered the truth, your husband and his friends had him killed." She opened the ledger. "And this book," she said, her voice rising with every word, "is the proof. It details every single dirty secret, every bribe, every lie. This town isn't built on faith and hard work. It's built on a grave." The fire roared, illuminating their stunned, guilty faces. The truth was out, and it was burning hotter and brighter than any flame. Dry Creek would never be the same. The dawn broke over a changed world. The blacksmith shop was a smoldering ruin, a black, gaping wound in the center of town. But it was the town's spirit that had truly burned to the ground. The shame was a physical thing, thick and suffocating as the smoke that still hung in the air. The truth, once revealed, couldn't be unheard. It had poisoned the stories they told themselves, the pride they took in their pioneer heritage. Sheriff Boaz, looking 10 years older, did his duty. He locked up Josiah Crane for the arson, but everyone knew that was just the beginning. The real crime was the one they were all complicit in. He took the ledger and the treaty from Clara, his hands trembling slightly. "There will be an investigation," he said, not meeting her eyes. "The territorial marshal will have to be called." It was a surrender. The cover-up was over. The townspeople avoided Clara's gaze. They shuffled past, unable to face the woman they had so eagerly condemned. Widow Langley locked herself in her house, the curtains drawn tight. Her reign as the town's moral authority had ended in a single, fiery night. The power structure of Dry Creek had crumbled to ash. Clara, Red Elk, and Zeke stood on the porch of the small schoolhouse, watching the sunrise paint the bruised sky. They were exhausted, battered, but they were whole. Zeke stood between them, holding both of their hands. He hadn't said another word since his desperate shout, but he didn't need to. The silence was different now. It was peaceful, not haunted. He had broken the spell. Red Elk looked out at the land, his land. He wasn't looking at it with anger or a thirst for vengeance. He looked at it with a deep, quiet sorrow. "All that poison," he said softly, "for a piece of dirt." "It was never about the dirt," Clara replied, her voice filled with a new strength. "It was about the lie. Now, the lie is dead." In the days that followed, a quiet exodus began. The preacher, his hypocrisy laid bare, packed his bags and was gone by morning. The Peters family sold the ruined smithy for pennies and headed west. The town was shrinking, cleansed by the fire of the truth. Those who remained were the ones who had been on the fringes, the quiet families who had never been part of the ruling elite. They were humbled, uncertain, and looking for a new way forward. They started to look at Red Elk differently, not as an outsider, but as a man who had been deeply wronged. They saw the quiet dignity with which he carried his history. They saw him not as a savage, but as the valley's rightful heir. He began to teach some of the older boys how to track, how to read the land in a way they never had before. He showed them the sunstone on the ridge and told them the story of the Starwater clan. He was replanting his roots. Clara reopened the schoolhouse. But she wasn't just teaching Psalms anymore. She was teaching history, the real history. She told the children the story of the Comanche who had lived here, of the treaty that was signed and betrayed. She taught them that a home built on a lie cannot stand. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Red Elk turned to her. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have pretty words. He just took her hand. "Thomas wanted to build a home here," he said. "With you. The lie prevented it." He looked into her eyes. "The lie is gone now. Let us build it. Together, you, me, and the boy." It wasn't a proposal born of need or convenience. like his first desperate offer had been. It was a proposal born of truth, of a shared history and a hard-won future. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in a long, long time, they were tears of joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes. They didn't have a big wedding. The town didn't have the heart for celebrations. Instead, one clear afternoon, they walked with Zeke to the top of the ridge overlooking the valley. Red Elk built a small fire. He spoke words in the Comanche language, his voice carrying on the wind. Clara spoke a simple vow from her heart. Zeke, their witness, their son, carved their initials into the trunk of a windswept pine. A circle for Clara, a feather for Red Elk, and a star for him. They became the new heart of Dry Creek, a family forged not by blood, but by fire, truth, and resilience. The town slowly began to heal, its foundations now built on the solid rock of an honest past. The wind still blew across the prairie, but it no longer sounded like a sigh of regret. It sounded like a whisper of hope. A new story was being written in the dust, a story of justice, a story of home. They had faced down the mob, exposed the lie, and reclaimed a future that had been stolen. In the quiet that followed the storm, they found more than just peace. They found each other. The world will always try to name you, to put you in a box based on its own fears. But your true name is written in the choices you make when the fire's at your back and the truth is in your hands. If you believe that courage is quieter than a shout and that justice is worth fighting for, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the strength hidden in the most unexpected places. And let me know in the comments, what does it truly mean to build a home?